December 12, 1990. A group of children in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas stumble across a mannequin lying in plain view. But as they approach it, they quickly realize that it isn't a mannequin at all. It's a woman with dark hair lying face up with her eyes closed, wearing nothing but a t-shirt. Her face and chest are bruised and smeared with blood. Unquestionably, she's dead. As they wait for police to arrive, a local man, horrified by the sight, fetches a bedsheet to cover her naked body up. Discovered in an area known for drug deals, addicts, and prostitution, the woman is quickly identified as 33-year-old Mary Lou Pratt, a sex worker well known to the police who operated out of the Star Motel. Mary was not known for soliciting customers on the streets. Instead, she waited on a specific corner for one of her regular clients to arrive, making her murder particularly shocking. The case is quickly assigned to seasoned investigator John Westphalen. Known for his aggressive interrogation methods, Westphalen was the department's most tenacious detective, but Westphalen knew it would be a difficult case to solve from the get-go. The body had been killed elsewhere and dumped where it was found, and with no fingerprints, no murder weapon, and no clear motive, anyone associated with Mary or the Star Motel could be a potential suspect. Sent to medical examiner Dr. Elizabeth Peacock to conduct an autopsy, she identifies needle marks on her arms, a clear sign of her struggles with addiction, and a gunshot wound in the back of her head, inflicted by a .44 caliber bullet. But then, with Detective Westphalen watching, things take a disturbing and unexpected turn. When the doctor opens one of Mary's eyelids to examine her eye, she's shocked to find only muscle and tissue. The eye is completely missing, but it hasn't been gouged out in a fit of rage. It has been removed with surgical precision. Checking Mary's other eye, Dr. Peacock is met with the same unsettling absence. Whoever had killed Mary had expertly extracted both of her eyes, leaving no damage or evidence on her eyelids. Little did the investigators know, however, this was only the beginning of a horrific slew of crimes committed by a killer who would soon come to be known as Initially, rumors suggested that Mary and another sex worker had stolen goods from a warehouse owned by one of their clients. So despite the twisted nature of the crime, the detectives wondered if the murder could have been an act of revenge. But if these rumors were true, Westphalen and his team failed to substantiate them or to locate the supposed client. After receiving a tip, they questioned a pair of Hispanic brothers, but again found no evidence linking them to the crime in any way. Keeping the gruesome nature of the mutilation from the media so as not to damage their ongoing investigation, Mary's murder gained little attention from the press or the public, and it wasn't long before it had completely faded into obscurity. Because of the unusual nature of the crime, Detective Westphalen reached out to the FBI's Violent Crimes Apprehension Program unit, hoping to utilize their database of past violent crimes to see if there was an offender or previous incidents that matched his crime scene. Yet even the FBI had no reports of anything resembling the mutilation of Mary Pratt. They did, however, help generate a profile for him, theorizing that the killer likely murdered for pleasure and kept the eyes as trophies to help him relive the intense feelings associated with his acts of violence. Importantly, they highlighted that such killers usually find that the sensations linked to their trophies fade over time, resulting in them seeking new victims. After 2 months, detectives still had no evidence, no clues, and no genuine suspects. The case looked set to turn cold like so many before, and so many after it. On February 8th, another sex worker who worked at the Star Motel with Mary, Susan Peterson, told a patrol officer that she believed she knew the identity of the man who had murdered her friend, not providing a name at the time, before detectives on the case had even been informed to follow up on her claim. On February 10th, Susan's dead body was discovered on the exact same street Mary had been found on. Just like Mary, Susan was found wearing only a t-shirt. While she had been shot in the back of the head like Mary, she had also been shot in the left breast and in the top of her head. Her body was located at the opposite end of the road, under the jurisdiction of the Dallas County Sheriff's Department. So Susan's case was initially assigned to Detective Larry Oliver, who was unaware of the specific details of Mary's case. As he observed the autopsy, the pathologist began with the standard external examination before opening Susan's eyes, one at a time. Detective Oliver was taken aback to find that both eyes had been surgically removed with small incisions, leaving no signs of bleeding or damage at all. The pathologist informed Detective Oliver about Mary's alarmingly similar case from 2 months prior, and within 24 hours, he met with Detective Westphalen. It seemed clear to detectives that they were dealing with the same monster who had killed Mary, and that the FBI's presumption that they would strike again had been tragically accurate. Although those present avoided the term serial killer, They all understood they were dealing with a highly intelligent and twisted murderer who was leaving bodies in areas that ensured they would be discovered by morning. Because both murders had occurred in similar locations, detectives believed their killer was likely someone who either lived or worked nearby, rather than a transient passing through. The detectives wanted to keep the details out of the media to avoid drawing attention to the Star Motel, and potentially alerting their unidentified suspect, who might then flee or shift to another area. However, their supervisors believed it was the department's duty to inform the community about the threat, and to make sure local sex workers were aware of the danger. They also hoped that the publicity might generate new leads, as they had very few clues to pursue. Even though they withheld details about the eyes, rumors quickly began to circulate among reporters about the unusual facial mutilations. When questioned by a journalist, one detective described the removals as being done in a nearly surgical manner. This led to a media frenzy, with the press labeling the brutal assailant as the Dallas Ripper and the Eyeball Killer. Potentially dealing with a serial killer, Special Agent Judd Ray of the FBI joined the investigation. With the limited evidence they had, he speculated that the killer was likely white, due to the fact that killers generally target individuals of the same race. Though there are of course exceptions to this. Special Agent Ray also speculated that a killer who engages in such brutal acts of mutilation would likely also have other unusual tendencies, and potentially even a history of mental instability. It also seemed likely that the killer possessed some degree of medical knowledge due to the precise nature in which the eyes had been removed. With no leads to follow, given the killer had taken 2 months to kill again, detectives feared he might strike again in April. In preparation, extra squad cars were deployed to monitor areas they believed he might target. Police also began warning sex workers to stay off the streets, and the media frenzy intensified as news of a potential serial killer spread. Then, on March 18th, nearly a month earlier than they'd predicted, a third victim was discovered. The body of 41-year-old Shirley Williams, an African-American sex worker, was found discarded on the pavement in a puddle of blood by a waitress heading to work, posed across from a school. Shirley had been shot through the top of the head and in the face, and had suffered severe facial bruising and a broken nose. Arriving at the scene, Detective Westphalen asked the medical examiner to check the status of Shirley's closed eyes. Lifting her eyelids, they found that both her eyes were missing, confirming they were dealing with the same killer who now, with 3 victims, could officially be labeled as a serial killer. Yet again, there were no fingerprints or semen or evidence of any kind found at the scene. They did, however, discover an unwrapped red condom beside the body. During Shirley's autopsy, however, the medical examiner found something new: the broken tip of an X-acto blade embedded in her right eye socket, indicating that the killer had been in a rush this time. Most concerning was that the killer had targeted a black woman and changed his location. This left them unable to predict where he might strike next, or where he would dispose of the next body. Looking into Shirley's movements, it did seem like there was only a small window between when she was last seen alive and when her body was discovered, further backing up the idea that he had been rushed. Shirley had been with other sex workers the previous night, using drugs, and had assured her daughter she would be home, before getting into an unknown car wearing a yellow raincoat. Knowing Shirley had been wearing a bright yellow raincoat and had likely been killed near to where she was last seen due to the limited time gap police had developed for her murder, they began searching for her clothes, hoping to find the true crime scene this time. They combed through a nearby field and vigorously searched secluded spots used for sexual encounters where the murder and mutilation may have occurred, but found nothing. Simultaneously, forensic experts meticulously examined Shirley's body and items discovered near to her body, looking for any tiny trace of evidence. Examining hairs collected from the back of her neck with tape, they analyzed them under a microscope, discovering one single hair that did not belong to Shirley. It was a pubic hair from a Caucasian. Although it didn't directly lead them to a suspect right now, they knew it could be a vital piece of evidence once they had an actual suspect in custody to compare it to. Ballistics analysis also managed to confirm that the gun used to kill Shirley matched the gun used to kill Mary, the first victim. This finally settled any lingering doubt that Shirley was not a victim of the same killer due to the discrepancies. Though the gun used to shoot the second victim, Susan, was a different weapon. Investigators were confident that the almost identical mutilations between Susan and Mary would make it easy to link their cases in a courtroom to a single offender. But with the killer having struck 3 times already, and detectives including the FBI being no closer to identifying a suspect, let alone catching him, they needed a stroke of luck if they were going to stop him before he killed again. Back in September, officers John Matthews and Regina Smith had been assigned to their newly created beat patrolling Oak Cliff's Jefferson Boulevard, in a post intended to help foster community relations and address petty crime in the area. Officer Matthews, 28, had been part of the Dallas police force since he was 21. Coming from a family of law enforcement, with a father who was a New York State Patrol officer, he grew up listening to his dad's stories. His previous patrols in high crime and prostitution areas had toughened him up, so the dismal nature of his current beat didn't faze him. Officer Smith, 31, had a different background. Before joining the police force, she graduated from a fashion merchandising college, worked as a supermarket cashier, and was a single mother to a 6-year-old. Inspired by an article about the need for more female officers of color, she pursued a career in law enforcement. Before entering the police academy in 1988, she had never been in a fight, seen a corpse, or fired a gun. Despite facing ridicule from her instructors and being assigned to a tough night shift, she was determined to succeed. During their time on the beat, Smith found she had a knack for engaging with local sex workers. She wanted to connect with them to help improve their situations and even kept a hook book, a collection of mugshots of the sex workers she encountered. All the way back in December, before the first body was discovered, they spotted Veronica Rodriguez, a 26-year-old sex worker well known to them, with a deep gash on her head. Veronica told them that a man had picked her up the night before, taken her to a remote field and assaulted her. He then tried to kill her with a knife, but she managed to escape and run all the way to the house of a friend. When her attacker saw she had reached safety, he fled back to his car, but not before being spotted by the witness. Given the violence frequently experienced by sex workers, the officers didn't connect her account to the murder of Mary when it occurred, especially since Veronica had a reputation for lying and exaggerating the truth. But a couple of days after Mary's body had been discovered, the pair of officers noticed Veronica in a light blue truck with a balding, middle-aged white man. As Matthews escorted her out of the truck and into their squad car, Smith approached the driver. Running his license, she learned his name was Axton Schindler, and he resided at 1035 El Dorado. Veronica told them that Axton was not a client, which he backed up by claiming he had a wife called Dixie. According to her, he was actually the man who had rescued her from the previous attack she told them about. However, Axton seemed oblivious to what Veronica was claiming, stating he knew nothing about any attack or attempted murder. Assuming Veronica was lying as they'd come to expect, they arrested her for solicitation and arrested Axton for unpaid traffic fines they discovered on his record. Fast forward to March, and with 3 murders having occurred in the same general area now, Matthews and Smith, who knew both of the first 2 victims well, began gathering information from the local sex workers about any and all of their peculiar clients. One disturbing story came to them from a 17-year-old black sex worker called Brenda. Brenda revealed that a couple of days before Shirley's body was found, a white John had attempted to attack her. She described him as older with salt and pepper hair and a mustache, and driving a dark station wagon. She had gotten into his car, but when he proposed they drive somewhere she didn't know to have sex, Brenda refused, wanting to stick to areas she was familiar with. This caused the man to unleash his anger on her, screaming and shouting at her about how he hated whores and was going to kill them all. As he drove off with her, she was forced to use her mace on him and to leap out of the moving vehicle. Matthews and Smith reviewed their hook book, reflecting on the various accounts from other sex workers, and found themselves lingering on Veronica's story about how she was almost killed. Even if she was often incoherent and dishonest, she had been consistent over the months in telling the story of her near-fatal encounter. So the pair of officers decided to check out the one lead they did have from her, Axton Schindler, wondering if they could find more detailed county records than the ones they previously accessed that had shown nothing but a handful of parking fines. At the sheriff's office, a deputy assisted them in looking up Schindler, discovering his stated address was registered to a man called Fred Albright, who happened to own several more properties, including some close to where the first 2 bodies had been found. The only problem was Fred Albright was listed as deceased. While this should have been a dead end to an unlikely hunch, something miraculous then happened. The deputy recognized the name Albright. He had recently received a tip about somebody called Charles Albright, who it turned out was Fred's son. A woman had told the deputy that having previously served Charles at a clothing store at a mall, he often brought her gifts and she eventually agreed to start dating him. According to her, Charles admitted that he was a con artist with a stash of stolen goods and had persuaded her to move into one of his rental properties not long after they started dating. But once there, Charles became increasingly unsettling, revealing a disturbing obsession with knives, and most importantly to the case at hand, eyes. Although she had long since moved out and even gotten married to someone else, She had a lingering fear that Charles would find her and harm her. She also claimed Charles frequently solicited local sex workers. Looking up Charles, Matthews and Smith were perplexed to discover that his address was listed as the same as Axton's. He also had a lengthy criminal history, including a conviction for assaulting a child. They even discovered he was married to a woman called Dixie, the exact same name Axton had given Smith before. Upon viewing his mugshot, they immediately saw him as a fit for the description Brenda had given of her assailant. Taking all of this information to Detective Westphalen, he agreed that they were onto something, and immediately had his officers show a lineup of photographs to Brenda, including one of Charles, to see if she could identify the man who had threatened her. Without hesitation, she instantly pointed to Charles. They then showed the same lineup to Veronica, who visibly shook upon seeing Charles and refused to identify anyone. Detective Westphalen instructed them to bring her in for questioning, emphasizing that if she didn't cooperate, they wouldn't have enough evidence to move forward. In the interrogation room, he attempted to appeal to her emotions, discussing the brutal murders of the 3 victims and explaining that her assistance was crucial to getting the killer off the streets. Calmly, she reviewed the mugshots again, reached for Charles's photo, flipped it over, and signed her name on the back, confirming his identity as the suspect. Finally, the detectives had a suspect for their serial killer, Charles Albright. Police quickly secured a warrant for Charles's arrest, planning to charge him with attempted murder and assault based on the women's testimonies and hopefully uncover more information tying him to the 3 murders. On March 22nd, an elite tactical team surrounded Charles's home in Oak Cliff on El Dorado. Outside, there was a station wagon in the driveway that matched Brenda's description. Calling the house phone, a male voice answered, confirming he was in the house. Police immediately shattered a window and tossed stun grenades inside, while others broke down the front door. Police handcuffed Charles and escorted him outside, where he remained silent, while his partner Dixie exchanged scared and confused glances between Charles and the officers, unable to believe that the man she loved could be guilty of such accusations. Both Charles and Dixie were taken to the police station while investigators searched their home, planning to check all of the properties tied to him. Combing through his house, they discovered countless books about serial killers, human anatomy, and even Nazi literature. They also discovered a stash of red condoms that matched the one found beside Shirley's body. Some accounts claim they discovered an obsessive amount of female dolls and eyeless paintings, though this information is inconsistent across accounts and hard to verify. Collecting any evidence that could potentially prove helpful, they went as far as to gather debris from his vacuum cleaner. They also located a hidden compartment filled with firearms, despite Charles having claimed he owned no weapons. Among the weapons was a Smith & Wesson .44 caliber revolver that matched the type used in the murders. In another property, they found several X-Acto knives with sharp blades, matching the one found in Shirley's eye, though they failed to find any of the missing eyeballs they'd assumed had been kept as trophies. Detective Westphalen initially focused on interviewing Dixie, who seemed genuinely shocked and disturbed by the allegations against her partner. According to her, Charles was easygoing and well-liked, and she claimed he was in bed with her on the night of all 3 murders, and only left for a short paper route in the morning, which he promptly returned from. This was potentially a problem, as the detectives didn't actually have any witnesses, placing Charles at or near the crime scenes on the nights the murders occurred. When presented with Charles's criminal history, Dixie was once again shocked. She had not known about any of his past crimes or his alleged association with sex workers, but she still refused to accept he could be responsible for the murders. She also could not explain his stash of condoms, as she was past the menopause and they did not use them together. When they questioned Charles, he vehemently denied knowing any of the murder victims or any of the sex workers who had identified him. He tried to explain away his criminal record, which involved mostly petty crimes, and provided an explanation and excuse for the sexual assault conviction. It had been a false accusation, but he didn't want to go through the hassle of a trial, so pled guilty. When questioned about Axton Schindler, it turned out that he was one of Charles's tenants, though Charles was surprised Axton had used his own address on his driving license. As they interviewed Charles, the detectives found him to be charming and easy to talk to. He didn't match the typical profile of a serial killer. Charles held a master's degree, spoke multiple languages, and used to be a science teacher. He had no history of drug abuse or mental illness. He had been a football coach and had a range of hobbies, such as playing the piano. He was in a happy relationship, and he had an alibi for all 3 crimes. He even showed no hesitation for the police to search his properties and test his guns. Almost everyone in his life that the police interviewed remained steadfast in their belief that they had the wrong man. They all highlighted that Charles was kind, caring, and generous, and was always willing to help anyone in need. At 57, with all of these traits, Charles was nothing like the much younger, angry serial killers normally responsible for such crimes. Nor was he anything like the profile the FBI had developed for the killer. Typically, as we've seen many times before, serial killers are socially isolated, struggle to maintain jobs and relationships, and are driven by impulsive desires. One thing they did identify, however, was that Charles's lifestyle was quite parasitic. Although he had inherited a considerable sum after his father's death, he had squandered it. And as a result, he relied entirely on Dixie to pay all of his bills, with seemingly no sense of guilt or shame. A couple of Charles's friends from a softball team also told the detectives about a recent incident that could be relevant. After a game, they had seen a car drive by with two women and jokingly suggested Charles should go after them. Charles then supposedly hissed through clenched teeth, "I'd kill them if I could," shocking and confusing them. After a tense silence, he laughed it off, claiming he despised sex workers because his birth mother was one. Many of the sex workers Matthews and Smith spoke to also recognized Charles as a frequent customer, though many claimed he was generous, often giving them large payments and gifts. Charles also was found to have a background in taxidermy, which provided a plausible explanation for the precise nature in which the victim's eyes had been removed. While he might not have been typical of serial killers known at the time, his charming, intelligent front actually fit very well with what was known about psychopathy. Could Charles have been using this facade to manipulate and take advantage of others, with no sense of remorse? He seemed to show little guilt whenever they caught him in a lie, such as the fact that he clearly did know and visit sex workers. This left detectives with a dilemma. Charles did not fit the profile of a typical serial killer, but he did fit the profile of a psychopath. If he was the wrong man, given the way the media was sensationalizing the case, it would create a big problem for them. Not to mention, it would give the real killer a chance to kill again or flee the area. Charles himself was so confident they were mistaken, he assured them that no woman would ever come forward to claim he had treated them poorly. So detectives needed desperately to determine one thing: did they have the right man? While Charles was in custody because of his complete mismatch to their expected profile and behavior, police continued looking at other suspects. Many of Charles's friends and family pointed the finger of blame at Axton Schindler instead. The police did track down and question Axton, given Veronica had claimed he was involved in preventing her assault. Axton told them that he had never met Charles directly, despite renting a property from him and using Charles's home address on his driving license. Axton also claimed that the man attacking Veronica was not Charles, but was actually a Hispanic man called Joe. As far as police could tell, Axton lacked the skills to be able to extract the victim's eyes with precision, and they never truly viewed him as a solid suspect. They did, however, locate an empty box of .44 caliber bullets discarded behind his property that matched those used in two of the murders, but they couldn't rule out that Charles had been the one to leave it there, given he owned the property. Despite thorough searches, detectives found no evidence of the murders occurring at Charles's home, nor did they discover any of the missing clothing belonging to any of the victims or the missing eyes. To complicate matters further, the .44 caliber gun they found in his hidden stash turned out not to be a match for the weapon used in the killings of Mary and Shirley. Dixie was even able to provide receipts indicating that their vehicles had been at garages and inoperable during the first two murders. Able to keep Charles detained on attempted murder charges based on the testimony of the two women who had identified him, they continued searching. In Axton Schindler's apartment, they uncovered a large collection of porn magazines, as well as a setup for autoerotic asphyxia. Because this specific location had been mentioned by Veronica as somewhere Charles had been, they wondered if he, as the landlord with a key, had used the space while Axton was away. Getting results back from the vacuum debris and blankets seized from Charles's trucks, however, they did discover a range of hair strands, including some that were consistent with those of Shirley, although the samples were too small to conduct DNA testing, based on the technology available at the time. According to their expert, Charlie Lynch, the samples of hair taken from Charles came back as closely resembling the ones discovered at the crime scene of Shirley. This method was risky. Unlike fingerprints, it was difficult to determine how many other men might share similar hair traits, and they could not definitively prove they belonged to a specific individual. Further tests revealed that hairs on blankets seized from Charles's truck were also potential matches for Mary and Susan. Despite this complete lack of concrete physical evidence, the district attorney chose to press forward and formally charge Charles with capital offenses in respect to the murders of Mary, Susan, and Shirley, meaning, should he be found guilty, he could be sentenced to death. Knowing they needed to keep digging and establish stronger links between Charles and the murders, the team of detectives continued to follow every line of investigation they could. Then, they received an account from an incarcerated sex worker called Mary Beth, who claimed she had had a harrowing encounter on the very night the first victim had been killed. According to Mary Beth, a man grabbed her outside a motel and pressed a knife to her throat, forcing her into his vehicle and driving her to a secluded field. The man then assaulted her, at which point he opened a case containing metal cylinders with sharp blades. He used one blade to cut open her blouse before discarding it and reaching for another. Mary Beth then lost consciousness, waking at some point later to find her assailant gone. Given the number of local sex workers who appeared to have had violent encounters around the time of the murders with Charles, the investigators decided to start questioning other sex workers to see if there were any more similar encounters they were unaware of. One such account came from Tina, who told officers Matthews and Smith that she had gone on several dates with Charles. But on their last outing in his truck, he became unexpectedly violent towards her, causing her to flee. Tina told them that the very night Shirley had been killed, she had seen Charles drive by, but she was with another client and didn't see if he picked up Shirley. However, when she returned, Shirley was gone. So following Tina, the officers and the detectives went to the field where she had frequently been with Charles, leading to the discovery of an old blue blanket, several condoms, and a crumpled yellow raincoat. The yellow raincoat, identical to the one Shirley was last seen wearing, had blood on it. Hairs found on both items were also deemed to be a potential match for Charles's samples. As well as this, detectives spoke to a man called Willie Upshaw who was serving time for illegal firearm possession, after discovering Charles had paid him multiple checks. Upshaw told them that Charles owned another .44 caliber gun they were yet to find, that had been purchased under his father's name. Furthermore, he told them that he was with Charles on the day his car had broken down, asserting that Charles definitely had access to another vehicle on the night Shirley had been killed. With a large number of stolen cars discovered around the time, they theorized that it was entirely possible that Charles could have used any one of them. Lynch also discovered that Charles's hair was a match for one found on the body of another victim, another sex worker, Rhonda Bowie, who had been stabbed to death in 1988 in the Oak Cliff area. However, when Charles provided a solid alibi, they chose not to pursue the charge. And so, with all this additional evidence, preparations for the trial against Charles for the murder and mutilation of the three women was underway. Although the case initially involved capital murder charges for all three women against Charles, the charges were downgraded to simpler murder charges due to the lack of concrete evidence, removing the death penalty from the table. Furthermore, the district attorney's office made the decision to remove the charges for the murders of Mary and Susan, instead focusing their case exclusively around the murder of Shirley, which they believed was more likely to result in a conviction. This posed a significant risk, however, as the judge warned that should they fail to prove he was responsible for the murder of Shirley, they would not be allowed to reinstate the other two murder charges. They were, however, allowed to introduce evidence from the other two cases to show potential links between them. With Charles held in prison on a $750,000 bond, the trial was set for December 2, 1991, less than a year after the discovery of the first victim's body. At the trial, the prosecution team relied heavily on the evidence gathered by Matthews and Smith from the various sex workers they had spoken to. A witness recounted an incident where she and the second victim, Susan Peterson, had spent a night with Charles in which he violently assaulted them both, handcuffing them and beating them with an electric cord for 30 minutes. By contrast, Veronica took the stand, but changed her account and claimed that Charles had never harmed her and that the police had coerced her into identifying him. Similarly, Willie Upshaw changed his testimony against Charles, instead emphasizing that he did not own a car during the time of Shirley's murder. Special Agent Judd Ray testified that the manner of mutilation in all three murders was so unusual, it would be unlikely to not be the doing of a single individual. Dr. Peacock, who had examined Mary's body, testified about the difficulty of severing the optic nerves and muscles in the eye, highlighting the killer's precision and skill. The substantial gasoline bills Charles frequently paid were also used as evidence for his late-night driving throughout all of the alleged encounters. Shockingly, the prosecution managed to lose Shirley's yellow raincoat before the trial, claiming it had been accidentally thrown out, despite it being a key piece of circumstantial evidence tying Charles to her murder. It was, after all, found at a location they only checked because Charles was said to frequently see sex workers there. With all this contradictory testimony, despite them lacking definitive identification, the hair samples became the main hope for the prosecution's case to be successful. Forensic analyst Charlie Lynch claimed that they had discovered 8 hairs matching Shirley in Charles's vacuum cleaner, as well as 3 from Susan and 4 from Mary on the blanket taken from Charles's truck. He also claimed they had found a number of Shirley's hairs in the Oak Cliff field, as well as 3 pubic hairs matching Charles, and a head hair matching Charles on the bloody raincoat. And, of course, he claimed that the hair discovered on Shirley's body matched Charles too. The defense were quick to point out, however, that Lynch had further matched Charles's hair to the 1988 stabbing sample from Rhonda Bowie, despite the fact that he wasn't even in town when it happened. The defense called upon their own expert, Samuel Pelenick, who criticized Lynch's analysis of the hair samples, arguing that it was insufficient to support his claims and careless to make it sound like it was provably hair from Charles or any of the victims. He even pointed out that some of the hairs Lynch had highlighted weren't even human. To make the whole hair debate even more confusing for the jury, Pelenick himself admitted he hadn't had long enough to study the samples, and upon spending more time looking at them he changed his testimony and agreed with a number of Lynch's claims. The defense called upon numerous other witnesses, including Charles's girlfriend Dixie, who recounted details about the broken-down car, and a fellow newspaper delivery person who noted that Charles always arrived on time for their deliveries, and could not have had time to abduct, kill, and dismember women. The defense instead pointed the finger at Axton Schindler, who had left town a week before the trial, especially as the box of .44 caliber ammunition had been found behind his rented home. But none of the sex workers who claimed to recognize Charles, aside from Veronica, seemed to have any familiarity with Axton, and Axton's hair samples didn't match any that had been collected. Charles chose not to testify, remaining slumped in his chair throughout the trial. Ultimately, on December 18th, the jury found Charles guilty of the murder of Shirley Williams, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole, with the defense immediately declaring it had been a wrongful conviction of an innocent man, and that they planned to challenge it. Charles's legal team instantly filed an appeal, arguing there was insufficient evidence to support his murder conviction. But in 1994, the Texas Court of Appeals dismissed and rejected the appeal, upholding the initial ruling. While in prison, Charles sought help from Barry Scheck's Innocence Project, which focuses on post-conviction DNA testing in cases with biological evidence. However, because the case didn't actually involve any DNA, it doesn't appear that they took on Charles's case. I do find this interesting though, as would someone really push to have DNA tested unless they felt the results would help their case? Several deep dives into Charles's life and the case against him have reached the conclusion that he may have been innocent, including one carried out by the Department of Psychology at Radford University in Virginia. Many of Charles's friends and acquaintances maintained his innocence throughout his life, even after discovering elements of his criminal background, sticking firm to the idea that Axton Schindler was the true culprit, and that a miscarriage of justice occurred in the trial. Despite these claims, Charles remained incarcerated at the Clements Unit in the Texas Department of Corrections, and in interviews, he claimed he'd lost communication with Dixie. One journalist noted that Charles was subscribed to a magazine focused on iridology while in prison, with its first issue featuring a prominent eyeball on its cover. The HBO series Autopsy also claimed that Charles spent much of his time in prison creating drawings of eyeballs and hanging them up around his cell, featuring footage of him drawing one. By 2017, Charles was moved to the John Montford Psychiatric Unit in Lubbock, Texas, where he remained until his death in 2020 at age 87. To this day, it remains unclear whether he was truly responsible for all 3 murders, or even the one murder he was convicted of. Or, by contrast, if he was responsible for many more murders due to his ability to leave no evidence at the crime scenes. If he did not remove the eyes of other victims, there would be no way to tie them to him. Notably, the eyeball murders did stop once he was incarcerated. However, while you may have already reached some conclusions about this case, there's something we haven't yet done which we typically do in these deep dives. We haven't gone all the way back to the start. Born on August 10, 1933 in Amarillo, Texas, Charles Albright was adopted from an orphanage by his parents Dell and Fred, who lived in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas. While Charles was their pride and joy, their parenting methods were extremely unusual. Dell imposed odd punishments on Charles. At one point, before he was even 1 year old, she locked him in a dark room as punishment for chewing on her tape measure. When he refused to take naps, she tied him to his bed, and if he didn't drink his milk, he was spanked by her. At times, she would dress him in girls' clothing and make him carry a doll, a practice he didn't understand and resented deeply, though he complied to avoid conflict. This memory and the accompanying bitterness lingered with him into adulthood. As a child, Charles tried to escape from his parents' yard whenever he could. To keep him from wandering off, his mother resorted to tying him to the porch. Despite her harsh and unusual discipline, Dell, who was an elementary school teacher, was determined for Charles to excel. With her guidance, he thrived academically, skipping 2 grades and mastering a variety of skills. He could play the piano, identify constellations, and even perform tap dance at the famous Texas Theater. However, Deli's obsession with cleanliness was extreme. She insisted that Charles drink only goat's milk from their backyard goats, believing it to be the healthiest option. She was convinced that dog feces could carry the polio virus, so to instill a fear of it, she took him to the local polio ward. There, she had him look at sickly patients to discourage him from touching anything dirty. To further prevent him from getting dirty, she changed his clothes multiple times each day. Del even introduced him to the world of taxidermy at a young age, teaching him the intricate process of preserving animal bodies. She showed him how to use a variety of tools: knives for cutting through skulls, spoons for removing brains, and scalpels for carefully extracting eyes from their sockets. Charles became absorbed in perfecting his taxidermy projects, spending countless hours making sure his work looked as lifelike as possible. Charles would visit his local taxidermy shop, fascinated by the display of gleaming glass eyes, searching for the perfect pair. He even expressed a desire to collect them, just as other boys might collect marbles. However, Del refused to spend money buying glass eyes for him, instead forcing him to use buttons and marbles, sometimes even making him sew the eyes shut. Could this withholding of eyes for his art have played a role in creating an obsession within young Charles? As he grew older, Charles sought out small animals to hunt and kill, using a gun given to him by Del. He would then bring them home to stuff and display. This unsettling routine was accepted by Del and Fred as completely normal. Despite her unconventional and often questionable parenting methods, Del did instill some positive values in him. She emphasized the importance of treating women with respect, aiming to raise him as a gentleman. If nothing else, she was determined that he would be an advocate for the women in his life. At school, Charles was an excellent student. But outside of it, he engaged in petty crimes, resulting in him being arrested for theft and aggravated assault at age 13. Due to his age, he was ultimately released with a warning. This didn't deter Charles. Whenever caught committing crimes, he would deny any involvement, regardless of the evidence against him. A skilled liar, he often managed to persuade authorities of his innocence. Throughout his teenage years, he was required to go to bed at 8 p.m., and Del often chaperoned him on dates, maintaining strict control over his social interactions. Charles later reported that this level of supervision caused him frequent migraines. At 14, he gained some local fame when his parents gifted him a plot of land, which he sold to acquire more properties, earning him the title of world's youngest real estate man in the local newspapers. By the time he was only 15, thanks in part to Del's excessive tutoring at home, Charles had graduated high school and he managed to enroll at the North Texas State University. But only a year later, Charles was caught with stolen cash and guns. When Del learned of his arrest, she tried to make amends by offering to pay back the store owners he had stolen from and even attempted to act as his lawyer during sentencing. She went so far as to offer to serve his jail sentence in his place. Despite her efforts, Charles was given a year-long jail sentence, forcing him to leave college. Upon his release, Charles seemed keen to turn his life around and enrolled at Arkansas State Teachers College, majoring in pre-med studies and learning several languages. Although he was popular, his peers quickly noticed that he was prone to boasting and exaggerating, particularly when it came to the women he had supposedly slept with. And although he did continue to excel in his studies, he also resorted to stealing tests and altering grades, and he gained a reputation for being reckless and eccentric in the various clubs he joined. One particularly strange incident occurred when Charles discovered that his roommate had recently broken up with his girlfriend. Heartbroken, the young man had thrown away everything that reminded him of her, including photographs. Charles retrieved the discarded pictures and spent hours carefully cutting out the eyes. A few weeks later, when the roommate began displaying photos of a new girlfriend, Charles replaced the new girlfriend's eyes with those of the former one. The shocked roommate was horrified to find his ex-girlfriend's eyes staring back at him from various locations, including the ceiling and behind the toilet. Ultimately, Charles was expelled from college after once again being found with stolen property, though he managed to avoid prosecution. Still determined to succeed, Charles decided to forge his own academic path. He created fake bachelor's and master's degrees using stolen documents and forged signatures, convinced he deserved them despite his troubled past. He went on to marry one of his college girlfriends, Betty, who became an English teacher, and they started a seemingly normal life together, having a daughter. Despite being skilled in various fields, such as illustration and carpentry, Charles struggled to keep a job. So once again, he forged documents to secure a role as a teacher at a high school in Crandall, a small town east of Dallas. The principal was thrilled to have such a talented educator on staff. His college records claimed he held a master's degree in biology from East Texas State University and was pursuing a second master's in counseling and guidance, with plans to enter a PhD program in biology. While he did eventually get caught out by an administrator from the East Texas State University, he used his charm to help him avoid being prosecuted by the university. Though he did, of course, lose his job at the school. Following this, he ventured into various jobs but rarely stayed in one position for more than 3 months. His eclectic career included roles as an illustrator, a bullfighter on the Mexican border, a carpenter, and even a stylist and beautician after attending beauty school on a whim. By 1965, Charles and his wife had separated, officially divorcing around 10 years later. Interestingly, Betty later noted that she had never seen him lose his temper during their 10-year marriage, despite their ups and downs. He was then caught stealing hundreds of dollars worth of goods from a hardware store, resulting in a 2-year prison sentence, which he only served 6 months of. In 1981, with Charles now 48, his mother Dell passed away from cancer, prompting him to initiate a search for his birth mother, who, according to Dell, was a law student who had to give up her baby due to pressure from her family. Charles did eventually track her down, learning that Dell had lied about her background. According to Charles in later accounts, she was actually a sex worker, though in reality neither of these stories are true. His birth mother was a nurse. Charles visited her multiple times, bringing gifts and introducing her to his family and friends. Would he have put in such effort if she were the sex worker he claimed she was and seemed to despise her for? That very same year, Charles was prosecuted for molesting the young daughter of one of his neighbors, though somehow he managed to get away with a sentence of probation for it. He later claimed he was innocent of the crime and was not a sexual predator, but he had pled guilty to avoid the hassle of a trial. By 1986, with the deaths of both Dell and Fred Albright, Charles began to lose control. He became a familiar figure in Dallas's red light districts and entered into an affair with a woman, but she ended the relationship after a year, citing his increasingly aggressive behavior. This same woman's tip to the police would later lead to his identification. Not long after, Charles had met Dixie in Arkansas, sweeping her off her feet with elegant dinners and captivating conversations about art and nature. Dixie later described their intimate moments as gentle and fulfilling, noting that he never pressured her into anything inappropriate or used vulgar language. The notion that he could be unfaithful seemed absurd to her. Eventually, he invited her to move in with him, but Charles quickly squandered the inheritance he had from the death of his parents, and despite having retained rental properties that his father had owned that provided a steady income, including one that he rented to Axton Schindler, his outgoings far exceeded his incomings. This led to him relying heavily on Dixie's low-paying salary from her job at a gift shop to pay their bills. She even had to take out loans to cover their expenses. The only concession he made to Dixie was to take on a paper route, which he assured her he would leave for and return from before she even noticed, typically between 3 and 6:15 a.m. In reality, though, this was likely a front that allowed him to visit sex workers in the mornings without raising Dixie's suspicions. Reluctantly, she agreed, knowing he needed funds for his softball outings. At 57, he still maintained a level of fitness that made him a standout player in the local slow-pitch softball league. His teammates loved him, especially because he always brought a cooler filled with drinks for everyone. His teammates claimed that he rarely lost his temper, always striving to be kind and gain admiration. In any disagreements, he would concede without hesitation, avoiding conflict. He preferred to give gifts rather than engage in arguments. However, during a casual conversation after a game with his team, things took a strange turn. As they joked about 2 women in a passing car, someone suggested that Charles should approach them. His serious response shocked everyone. "I'd kill them if I could," he said with a dark scowl. When someone attempted to lighten the mood, Charles mentioned that the subject was sensitive for him because his mother had been a sex worker. This was the first time any of them had seen him react with anger. Bizarrely, neither his adoptive mother nor his birth mother, as far as we know, was a sex worker. It was during this period that Charles allegedly committed the 3 brutal murders, transitioning from a relatively average man to the infamous Dallas Ripper. In an interview while in prison, Charles was asked why a killer would want to keep the eyes of his victim. Charles's answer was as follows: "That would be the last thing I would want to keep out of a body. It would be a hand or a whole head maybe if you were a sick artist and you thought the woman was fabulous. You might not want to see that beauty go to waste." So, now that we've explored Charles's background, despite the case against him feeling largely circumstantial, There are a lot of details that I personally feel do explain why he may have become the monster he was alleged to be. Charles clearly had a long-standing fascination with eyes, and had the skills and know-how to be able to carry out the precise removal seen in the victims. To me, it seems unlikely that somebody so obsessed with eyes would just coincidentally have so much circumstantial evidence tying him to a string of murders centered around mutilating eyes. Is it possible that he formed a troubling connection between motherhood and prostitution? If so, he may have sought to punish maternal figures who had disappointed him by engaging with women he deemed the lowest. On one hand, he showed compassion by providing financial support to sex workers. On the other, he perhaps harbored resentment towards them. This inner conflict would have put him in a prime position for violence, and his newspaper delivery route does seem like it would have allowed him to roam the streets at night, while the relationships he built with local sex workers established a sense of trust, making it easier for him to convince them to go to secluded places with him. But what do you think? Do you think Charles was the Dallas Ripper who killed all 3 victims, and potentially even more? Or do you think the police arrested the wrong man based on circumstantial evidence? Either way, the trial evidence feels extremely weak to me, even if I do lean towards believing they had the right man in Charles. I tried to present this case a little differently from some of my other ones, so let me know what you thought about the structure down below. Did going into Charles's past at the end add or detract from the exploration of the case? As always, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and even consider joining my channel as a member. Dropping a comment down below is also extremely helpful in getting the video picked up in the algorithm. You have been watching The Mystery Abyss.